She's nearly twice the size of India's current biggest warship. She has spent nearly a decade literally being turned inside out at this remote facility in northeastern Russia. Her lumbering journey into the Indian Navy's hands has spanned 3 government tenures, enormous intrigue and a great deal of controversy. But now she's ready to do what she was built to. Today I stand on her deck to bring you this, the story of INS Vikramaditya. On a freezing, snow-blown November morning far from Indian shores, an old Russian relic became the Navy's newest born. As the national anthem wafted through the bitterly cold northern winds, the Vikramaditya's new identity flapped in the wind. In over half a century of modern seafaring, the Indian Navy hasn't operated anything a fraction as complex as the Vikramaditya. She dwarfs India's erstwhile flagship INS Virat and promises to allow an ambitious but hamstrung navy to venture farther and deeper into international waters than ever before. But along with its enormous bulk and the 1,600 personnel it will take to operate her on the high seas, the Vikramaditya comes with the big burden of history. For one thing, Vikramaditya is this ship's third name. She was originally commissioned into the Russian Navy as Baku in 1987, then renamed after naval pioneer Admiral Sergei Georgievich Gorshkov when the Soviet Union collapsed 4 years later. She may look spanking new today, and in many ways she truly is, but her journey into Indian hands began 2 decades ago. In 1994, P.V. Narasimha Rao, who was both Prime Minister and Defence Minister at the time, was offered the Soviet-era Admiral GORSHKOV aviation cruiser. The Indian Navy was immediately interested. But in the turbulent few years that followed politically in Delhi, the offer receded to the notorious Indian backburner. The first of many delays that would plague Project 11430, as it was codenamed. When the offer was back on the table, it was just before India went to war. In 1999, shortly after the Kargil War, the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government was offered a little-known Russian warship that had been rotting in its dock for more than a decade. Russia said, "The Admiral GORSHKOV is yours for free. All you need to do is pay for repairs and re-equipment." In the best traditions of India's notoriously slow decision-making when it comes to defense, it took nearly 5 years for India to sign on the dotted line. In July 1999, the ship was towed to Sverodvinsk, a Russian Cold War-era shipbuilding town famous as the site for the country's only manufacturer of nuclear submarines, Sevmash. After a decade of negotiations, the elusive contract was signed on the 20th of January 2004 in the presence of then Defense Minister George Fernandez and his visiting Russian counterpart Sergei Ivanov. It was the biggest defense deal thus far between the two old allies. By the end of that year, work had begun in earnest to transform a rusting heap of forgotten metal into the shining aircraft carrier that the Indian Navy had been promised. But as the first Russian engineers entered the insides of the great ship, they reeled in horror. A close inspection of the Gorshkov showed that she would never be repaired and refurbished in the promised 52 months. Russia, a veteran shipbuilder, and India, with its painstaking attention to detail, had managed to stunningly underestimate the scope of work involved. An aircraft carrier is so big, so enormously stable, that rough seas usually don't matter much to the crew on board. But the Gorshkov, which India had named Vikramaditya, happened to hit turbulence like it had perhaps never experienced before, and this before she had even left her dock. When work began on the Admiral Gorshkov, and remember the ship had been stagnating for nearly a decade, its insides had literally begun to rust and rot. This was no warship. It was a great heap of mostly useless metal. The numbers that began to jump out at the engineers made their heads spin. 2,300 kilometers of cables, 3,000 kilometers of pipes, modifications of 1,750 out of 2,500 compartments, 234 new hull sections fabricated from 2,500 tons of steel, thousands of motors, turbines and boilers had to be completely replaced, and this was just the beginning. The magnitude of the miscalculation gave the Indian Navy that terrible sinking feeling. The project was more colossal than it could have ever imagined. The old warship needed to be modified to cater for an all-new flight deck with arrestor wires, a full modification of its bulbous bow, huge aircraft lifts that would lead to a hangar for its fighter jets, brand new main boilers and diesel generators, the complete replacement of existing distilling plants, the fitment of reverse osmosis plants for clean water on board, and a fully new air conditioning and refrigeration plant. And this was before the Russian team could even think of giving the Gorshkov modern combat systems that would make it a true fighting ship. Realizing just how much the scope of work on the massive warship had actually been underestimated by both sides came as a terrible shock to the Indian Navy. The cost of the ship more than doubled to nearly $2.5 billion. More than the cost, it was the shattering delay of 5 years that seriously made things very hot for the Indian Navy. The incredibly over-optimistic time frame threw everything out of gear. Work on the Gorshkov ground nearly to a halt. A desperate Indian government, which had already begun paying for the program, knew that there was no backing out without inflicting irreversible damage to bilateral relations. Both sides sat down once again for a seemingly endless renegotiation of the original $947 million deal. Finally, in December 2009, over 5 years after the original deal was signed and a full year after the ship was originally to be delivered, India and Russia agreed on a fresh price, $2.34 billion, a painful cost escalation of more than 2.5 times. More importantly, India agreed to Russia's pledge that it would deliver the ship only in 2012, more than 4 years later than agreed upon in the original 2004 contract. Away from the windswept deck of the woefully incomplete ship, behind closed doors, the turbulence of negotiations between 2007 and 2009 very nearly sank the entire program. It is only now that we know how dangerously close things came to collapsing completely. The Indian Navy had no choice but to swallow hard and sail on. Its patience and resilience, fortunately, was rewarded. Slowly, very slowly, the promised transformation took place. Piece by painful piece, the old Admiral Gorshkov shed its skin to gradually reveal a ship that was by all accounts impressive and formidable. With baby steps that spanned over 2 years, the Russian and Indian teams finally mustered the confidence to push the new behemoth out to sea on her own steam. At midday on the 10th of June 2012, after 17 years, the erstwhile Admiral Gorshkov, now officially designated Vikramaditya, sailed for the first time on her very own power. It was a rare psychological boost for a program that had spent years with shattered morale. Only the Indian Navy could truly appreciate what the emergence of the Vikramaditya really meant. With the retirement of INS Vikrant, India's first aircraft carrier in 1997, the Navy bade farewell to a decade of operations with 2 aircraft carriers, an ideal number in the Navy's warfighting doctrine, allowing it to deploy 1 aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea and the other in the Bay of Bengal. The Vikramaditya's arrival heralds a return to that regime. After operating a single aircraft carrier for over 16 years, the Indian Navy is once again technically a 2-carrier force. The aging INS Virat, which has sailed for over 50 years, now has very welcome company. India's sole operational aircraft carrier, INS Virat is, quite frankly, on her last legs. A veteran of the Falklands War in the South Atlantic, the Virat is an exceptional vessel. But with her embedded fleet of Sea Harrier jump jets no longer packing the punch they once used to, the Navy knows that the Virat is only a shadow of the formidable presence she once was. Even so, the Indian Navy hopes to push the old British warhorse and keep her in service till the end of this decade. Or at least until India's first fully home-built aircraft carrier, the new generation Vikrant, is ready to join the Indian Navy. By that time, the Navy would have had a chance to open up the Vikramaditya in open ocean and discover what she's truly capable of.
We will be fully ready to take the ship to our home ports and our home waters safely and successfully, and ensure that the ship reaches there, and our people who are waiting for the ship are happy to see the ship on our shores.
Few know that the last 18 months before the Vikramaditya flew the Indian flag were nerve-wracking, stormy and replete with dangerous turmoil. When we return, we tell you the untold story of just what the Vikramaditya had to be put through to finally prove worthy of the Indian Navy. Enjoy these rare pictures of an earlier avatar of the Vikramaditya as we head into this very quick break. Join me on the other side as we continue this journey of the Navy's new most formidable weapon and tell you why she could be a game changer in the Indian Ocean.